friend just blurts out, "Dude, I think we're being watched." Saw a hand go across his tent. And after that, heard this kind of guttural sort of scream.
Do you consider yourself a researcher or do you consider yourself just a filmmaker storyteller?
So I would consider myself a researcher and a filmmaker. So obviously, I'm a storyteller. That's part of it. You're telling people stories. But prior to doing this, I was always interested in the kind of research aspect, even way before getting out in the woods and kind of looking myself. I was more of an armchair researcher type. I would read a lot of books. I mean, I've got a stack of books right here next to me of Sasquatch related things that I think it's important to learn from the old kind of things that were out there pre-internet. Especially the internet has tainted a lot of sources and has notoriously unreliable accounts. So I think it's important to look previous to that. And the people who first got involved in this topic, the John Greens and the Bernard Hwebelmans and whoever else kind of you want to talk about, that some are still with us, like Lauren Coleman and others that were sort of pioneers. So I was always interested in the theories and debating, what these things could be, that sort of thing. And then when I started really into my state of New Hampshire, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the second most forested state in the U.S. next to Maine. I mean, we're not a large state, but we have some very rugged mountain chains. And I grew up kind of assuming, well, Bigfoot is in other places. It's in the South with the skunk ape, or it's in the Pacific Northwest. But once you kind of peel back that Sasquatch onion a little bit, you go into some of the stories of the wild men and other stories from this area, sightings here in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s, even earlier. And these environments are perfect. And these are areas in New Hampshire that support moose and black bear and tons of other large forest dwelling animals, especially that returned after the area was heavily logged in the 18th and 19th centuries. So once I started looking into New Hampshire, I really started doing research and I started talking to people. I would track down eyewitnesses, and I have a collection, a database of sightings of about 50 sightings here from New Hampshire that, to my knowledge, aren't on any other public database. So I haven't seen them on the BFRO. I haven't seen them on other Bigfoot or cryptid databases online. They are reports that have either people have told me personally, I've gotten the chance to interview, they've emailed me their accounts, that sort of thing. So that's been really interesting. And that's something at some point I hope to publish and kind of discuss further. But that goes back now since about 2016, gathering those kinds of reports. And I'll get one every once in a while. Obviously now with a kind of larger reach with my series, I get a lot more stories and people even from the local area, which is always interesting to me because being from here, it's something I love to focus on. It's great being able to go to other areas of the country and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, if that were all to end tomorrow, I'd still be here in New Hampshire. So that's an area that I'm probably most keenly interested in, following up reports and alleged evidence and that sort of thing. So definitely consider myself a researcher. And I say cryptozoology researcher because I'm sort of researching the topic, and my interests are broader than just Bigfoot, as I've mentioned with some of the other works I've done. But Sasquatch is definitely the most prominent. I mean, there's so many places you go where you have those regional stories, whether they be the wood devils up here in New Hampshire, or the Mogollon monster of Arizona, or the skunk ape of the South, the Fouke monster. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Whereas something like the Lake Champlain monster mystery is confined to a single lake up in Lake Champlain in Vermont, New York. So that's a different beast, so to speak, than Sasquatch, where you can go to almost any mountainous or swampy area and there's some kind of local story revolving around that topic. So pretty much the same off camera as I am on camera. It's just sort of a visual documentation of what we're doing or how we investigate an area. So there isn't much of differentiation there, I'd say.
Do you have any certain stories that that really stood out to you that you felt like were more significant?
That's a tough question. There's a lot of stories that come to mind that really, I mean, stick out to me. I was just trying to do the math recently with Bigfoot Beyond the Trail alone. I think we're up to almost 80 interviews now with people. It's been almost exactly 2 years since we started doing this sort of Bigfoot Beyond the Trail series. And I think it's about 80 interviews between eyewitnesses and researchers. So that's just quite a lot within itself. But I've probably talked to a lot more through conferences prior to that. As I mentioned, with those 50 reports, 50 plus reports I have here from New Hampshire, there's just quite a lot of stories. There's some that are just unusual that kind of stick out. And I will preface by saying most of the sightings fall into a sort of category of, I wouldn't say normal, but in the sense that it's a Sasquatch being seen crossing the road or paralleling a hiker on a trail or throwing rocks at a house or something like that along those lines, where it's not anything complete very out of the ordinary that you hear about. Um, but oh boy, aside from perhaps the case of the Alaska cabin, which was featured in two of our documentaries, which I can get into. That is a kind of property up in Alaska where a friend of mine who I've come acquainted with now has had a lot of very interesting activity, and I think it's a very active kind of location, especially given the remote nature of it. It's about an hour boat ride from the nearest small port on the rugged Kenai Peninsula, which is sort of steeped in these temperate rainforests that are very similar to the rainforest you would see basically going from Southeast Alaska down to Northern California to the redwoods. It's that sort of Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest, the classic Sasquatch environment people think about, with those areas in between there, whether it be Vancouver Island or the Olympic Peninsula, coastal Oregon. Those habitats are some of the probably best habitat for something like Sasquatch. And indeed, that's where some of the richest folklore, whether they be Native American First Nation stories, come from, with stories like the Zonaqua and the Bukwas, the Oma, all that sort of stuff is well within that area, and just an area that's produced so many sightings over the years. And so this cabin is on that sort of kind of similar environment, steeped in between these mountains and the Kenai Peninsula. And it's right next to the ocean too. So you have all these ocean kind of food sources, as well as terrestrial brown bear, black bear, moose, mountain goats, lynx, those sorts of things, some of the critters you kind of would expect in that part of Alaska. And it's such a fascinating story because of how it all kind of came together. I was essentially contacted by somebody in 2021 about property they had built out in this area of remote Kenai Peninsula, and they were having strange stuff happening from the start. And I mean, there's too many incidents for me to even really go over in detail. They're covered in our film, The Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch, Part 1 and 2. But they started building this cabin, essentially middle of nowhere, and started having stuff happen from the first kind of instance, where they visually saw a rock that was size of a football fly horizontally out from the woods and into the ocean. Hearing whistles and loud baseball sounding knock type things, a roar that was described as sounding like a T-Rex roar, getting closer to them as they were operating chainsaws and cutting down a lot of the trees so they could clear land to put this cabin up. And in about 4 or 5 years of owning that cabin, especially the first few years, they had a lot of very interesting stuff happen, rocks thrown at them. They would actually find rocks inside the boat. They'd have their boat moored out a couple 100 feet into the bay, and they'd go clear the land during the day. Then they'd take the boats and go back to the boat at night, so they didn't sleep out in the open in an area with brown bear and black bear and other sort of dangerous animals, until a structure was put up, and they would find these sorts of rocks thrown into their boats. Now, this is an example of one I actually picked off the shore there in the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, and these are found all over the coastline there, and these are old fishing rocks. So what they would do is they would use these stones, which were abundant. I mean, they're everywhere on the beaches. All the beaches there are made of stone, basically like this. And they would wrap them in these nets and use them to weigh down their fishing nets and that sort of thing. It was just a lot cheaper than lead or metal, and they're everywhere. And these were the kinds of rocks they would find physically inside their boat, hundreds of feet out into the bay. They would hear a loud thud, and then when leaving or cleaning up the boat, they would find these sort of just inside the area of the boat, which is very unusual. And there was another instance where they had found this just placed on a chair there on a return trip. Lots of strange things going on there, and we went out there and spent 9 days out there and had a lot happen. I guess that's an overall a case that I find really interesting because of a lot of things involved. And one of the more intriguing angles as well was a lot of the audio they've recorded out there. I mean, very reminiscent in some cases of the Sierra Sounds in some aspects, but also they have this audio of what sounds like a baby crying kind of noise. Which is really intriguing. And, there are animals that can make sounds like a baby crying, but I've not found anything that matches the audio as this. And they've only ever heard or recorded this sound when women have been present on this remote property. So there's no other people living there. It's very isolated. You literally have to take a boat to get out there. And of all the times they've been there, it's only been twice that they basically ever heard this baby crying sound and recorded it. And it was when women were there. And that's intriguing because that connects to a lot of the Tlingit peoples and the The natives there in Alaska talk about the hairy man, the kushtaka, the otter man, making a sound like a baby crying noise to lure women and children into the woods. So is that connected to that? I don't know. That's just very intriguing. So that case is supremely fascinating. But there's been stories from across the U.S. that I've been very fascinated by upon hearing them. I mean, even here in my state of New Hampshire, just some of the encounters I've come across, too many to even really go over in any detail. But one intriguing one I'll go over real quick from northern New Hampshire. And I was told this actually at a library talk in early 2020. It was right before COVID started. I did a library talk that I do a few every once in a while. I get invited to speak about Bigfoot, and I'll do a Granite State Bigfoot talk, and I'll talk about some of the history and some of the sightings that I've come across. And a lady, and my favorite part is afterwards being told, having people come and share you their stories, maybe especially in an area like New Hampshire where it's culturally Bigfoot is not very popular. It's not great to talk about it. I mean, there's still sort of social stigma attached to the topic. So I'll often have people share me their sightings, and a lot of those sightings from those 50 plus reports I talked about come from those library talks that I've done. And early 2020, about January, this lady came up and shared me a story about either her father or uncle was a prison camp guard in a place in northern New Hampshire called Stark Camp, which was a real place. It was a prisoner of war camp during the Second World War. They had German POWs there. And they talked about, in that area, logging is very heavy. I mean, Berlin, New Hampshire, the city up there, they call it the city that trees built. There's paper mills and that sort of thing. It's a big industry in that area, just the abundance of trees. Makes sense. So they had these German POWs at Stark Camp on logging duty, and apparently they were refusing to go into the woods at one point because they heard or they saw what they described as gorillas in the woods, and that really kind of freaked them out. Some of the locals equated it to the story of the wood devils, which is a sort of old logging story that goes back into the 1800s here in New Hampshire that I've tried to track down but haven't been able to find the specific origins of. But I know it's a pre-internet story because I've been told by people that grew up in that area in the 60s and even earlier, hearing stories of their grandparents saying, don't go too far into the woods or the wood devils will get you. So it's very interesting. I find that these German POWs would talk about wood devil, or not wood devils, gorillas, seeing gorillas in the woods. Of all the animals they could possibly make up to maybe get off of doing logging duty or whatever. I mean, obviously they were there against their will. I mean, this was during Second World War. These men were there doing basically forced labor. Maybe they could make up the story of an elephant or a rhino or some other creature. Why a gorilla? So specific, and something that sort of interestingly fits into that Sasquatch kind of mythos, perhaps. A lot of the older reports describe gorillas prior to the words abominable snowman or Yeti or Bigfoot being known. You had the wild man reports. But once gorillas became sort of known as an animal that was established, you have reports of gorillas. I mean, I've got a report from the late 1800s near an area that I've had some stuff happen in the modern day that was of two boys being chased out of the woods by a gorilla and being quite frightened. So very specific language. In that case with Stark Camp, again, it was a real place. There's a famous incident of one of the German POWs had actually escaped and was caught in New York City, of all places. So it was a place that was known. I mean, you can look it up. There's nothing left of it now, of course. I think just a memorial. I haven't really been to that specific area, but my biggest regret of that story was not taking the woman's information down. I gave her my information. I should have taken her information down so I could then kind of hound her and try to get the specific details. But I kind of wrote some notes on it after I heard the story, but that was about it. I had a lot of other people sharing their stories with me that day, and I forgot, and she never reached out. So, and I've had a couple other people online in comments and that sort of thing mention this sort of, oh yeah, they saw wood devils up in Stark Camp in World War II. And I've always tried to follow up on that one because it really intrigues me. That's a pre-internet story that predates any of the modern Bigfoot craze, which started really in the late 1950s when the word Bigfoot kind of became ubiquitous that it has until now. So yeah, there's a lot of cases like that. I could probably go on for hours about interesting stories, but I've had friends that have had encounters and that sort of thing that really intrigue me, and people that I trust that I have a really hard time explaining what else they experienced other than a Sasquatch. So I have so many in my mind that I kind of can draw from, luckily. But what really intrigues me about a lot of these stories, whether it be in Kenai Peninsula of Alaska or New Hampshire or Florida, is the consistency in sort of behaviors that are reported. So a lot of the stuff that you see, a lot of the kind of common things, road crossing sightings, rocks being thrown, wood knocks, whoops, that sort of thing. There's a consistency there that I find really intriguing, that if everyone was sort of imagining this sort of stuff, I don't imagine there would be such a ubiquity with this sort of reported behavior. So that to me speaks of some sort of a species of some kind that has some sort of consistent behaviors. I mean, maybe there's regional differences, but it seems that there is a general sort of behavior or some sort of way of interacting with humans or mocking humans. Realistically, we don't know. I mean, one of the most common types of Bigfoot sightings everywhere is the road crossing sighting. I just interviewed a lady in Louisiana who saw something like that, kind of standing in the middle of the road as she was driving through the Honey Island Swamp, which is notable for the Honey Island Swamp monster. And it's these sorts of things are very common. So it makes you wonder, why is that? I mean, we know deer and other animals, rodents, these sorts of things, rabbits, smaller game, even moose or deer, which are larger animals but not particularly smart in terms of brain size. They cross the road because they panic. They see the headlights and, oh, I need to go quick, and they end up getting hit. So Sasquatch, for its ability to elude us, clearly has to be more intelligent than a deer or a moose or any of these other critters. So why is that such a common type of sighting? And I've kind of theorized, I know others have speculated over the years, maybe it's a sort of a coming of age type of game. Maybe it's playing chicken, hey, you cross the road when this car comes back. Let's freak this guy out. Maybe they're taunting us. Who knows? I mean, it's really anybody's guess, but there just seems to be such a commonality there with that type of sighting that it really is kind of intriguing. But I know I sort of rambled there on that answer, but that is, there's just so many sightings to draw from. What's the great thing too about when you have a mass of sightings is you can start plotting them out on maps and notice the common places that these things are seen. If this is all sort of a figment of our imagination or human projection of an ancient archetype, why are they being seen in specific habitats and not parks in downtown Brooklyn or very urban areas? Why are these sightings primarily, and especially very credible ones, clustered into areas that are national forests or national parks, mountain ranges or swamps, habitat where you have other animals that live and thrive? That's where these sorts of things are most commonly occurring, which is really interesting. So I think it speaks to there being a sort of underlying factor that there is something really out there.
Do you see any correlation in the individuals who actually do have these encounters? Is there any commonality between them?
I actually don't believe there's a lot of commonality between people who see these things. And I'll explain that. There is in some ways and there isn't. There is in the sense that these people are in the right place at the right time having a sighting. I think that's probably the number one key. A vast majority of sightings that are random chance occurrences like the road crossings or a person hiking, or they see it through the binoculars on a mountain or whatever the case may be, they're at the right place at the right time kind of thing. Because you can have an area that has potential Sasquatch in it, but if there are no people frequenting that area, you're not going to have any sightings. So that's really where the commonality ends. I've talked to people from every walk of life, every political persuasion that have had Sasquatch encounters, from people who would consider themselves extreme left wing to extreme right wing. There really is no barrier. Whether you're in extremely liberal areas of the Pacific Northwest or extremely conservative areas of Tennessee, there is consistent things being reported by people that probably don't agree on anything socially, that are reporting the same details. They're having rocks thrown at them. They're hearing whoops. They're seeing these creatures in and out of areas. So there isn't a lot of commonality. And you do have a lot of sightings, of course, from outdoorsmen, people who spend a lot of time in the woods, outdoorsmen and women, whether they be hikers or fishermen or hunters. Of course, those are probably, oversizing the data pool just because they're people who are out there a lot. But you have reportings from police officers, from people, lawyers, judges, people that are, maybe just driving a country road and have something run in front of them, that live in an urban area that otherwise probably wouldn't spend much time in that area. So there isn't a lot of commonality I see in terms of the eyewitnesses, because again, they range the spectrum. They probably live completely different lives from one another, but they're reporting the same kind of thing, which again speaks to my point earlier about there being an underlying sort of commonality overall, with there being some sort of creature out there that has consistent behaviors and consistent ways of interacting with humans. And mean, most encounters I place into two categories myself, which are, and this isn't anything revolutionary. This is not my own idea at all, but most encounters seem to fall into two categories. One being the chance, random kind of encounter where it's the car driving or the person out in an environment and they happen to run into something, or they're in the tree stand and they see one through the scope of their rifle, whatever. And the other category seems to be these things are coming towards people, whether it be at a home, there's some sort of interactions. A lot of times it's campers in remote areas. They'll start hearing rocks being thrown at them, or they'll have stuff circling their camp. So that seems to be, to me, a little more than the random ones where it's more of a something's coming in to check a human out. So that's where I typically, those kind of encounters, most encounters to me fall into those two categories. But yeah, again, to circle back to the idea about there being commonality between the witnesses, that there is and there isn't. I mean, there's just so many people from every walk of life who have reported these strange things in very similar ways, which to me only speaks to a little bit more credibility in terms of there being a source to these sorts of encounters, which would be some sort of a creature. Heard a few reports where people kind of described feeling uneasy, maybe a little bit in danger. I mean, I've talked to people who were combat veterans who felt a little bit intimidated. I mean, with something very aggressive kind of behaviors, stuff being thrown at you. I don't think that's ever really an enjoyable kind of thing. There's definitely people who have had encounters that seem to have some sort of PTSD if it's extremely traumatic, whether they're being roared at by something. This is something I've heard actually a number of times, but people who have both seen a Sasquatch and haven't, or have just seen, a limb. Like I've got a buddy who had an encounter in northern New Hampshire in the mountains where he saw a hand go across his tent. And after that, heard this kind of guttural sort of scream noise that he felt reverberate through his chest. And he said he was kind of paralyzed with fear. That's something I've heard with other encounters as well. People getting roared at, or if you were to be confronted with a gorilla and it started beating its chest and hooting at you and really directing its rage towards you, you probably would not feel very blessed or very, very at ease. It would be a very deeply uncomfortable sort of thing because it's a primal sort of fear. And I've had a couple times being out in the woods myself where I've had that feeling that is so stereotypical of this topic of the feeling of being watched, something people often report. And it's like this burning sensation you feel. And the most prominent time I had happen here in New Hampshire in a research area of mine, I was with a friend of mine who I didn't tell about any of the stuff that has happened in that area. And we're walking at night through this area, and we did a turnaround at one point on the trail, and we're coming back, and I get this intense feeling of you're being watched. And at the same moment I was thinking that, my friend just blurts out, "Dude, I think we're being watched." And I turned to him and I started cussing. I said, "What the heck are you talking about? How did you know I was thinking that?" He's like, "Dude, I don't know. I just have this tingling, weird kind of feeling." It was the most tangible I've ever felt that. And we kept walking down the trail. And then a few minutes after that, we proceeded to listen for about 10 minutes, something wood knocking and breaking sticks into a swamp that was sort of off the trail, maybe a few thousand feet away, but it was very loud. And he was kind of, shocked by all this. And afterwards we had the conversation. He said, "Dude, what was going on?" Like I said, "I don't know. I mean, this is an area where there have been reports of potential Sasquatch-like things. I've heard stuff out here, wood knocks and that sort of thing before. But I didn't tell him anything previously because I didn't want to color his experience. I just said, 'Hey, let's go on a night hike.' And he was a former hiking buddy of mine, so we've done a lot of mountain hiking together. So he was aware of the topic, but he wasn't really into it as I was. We just, when you're hiking 2-3 days at a time with somebody, those kinds of topics come up in the past. But that was really intriguing. But yeah, there's definitely been other people too that have described just feeling uneasy or fearful really for their life of being confronted by something that could probably, from the size of it, rip you apart, right? I mean, gorillas and chimps, which in some cases chimps are a lot smaller than humans. I mean, they have the strength of 6 men or however many it is, and they could basically rip your face off if they wanted to. So you have something that's reported 6 to 8 to 9 feet tall, weighing upwards of 1,000 pounds. That's very intimidating. I mean, I've been rushed by moose before in parts of northern Maine, had one run right past my tent. Very, very fearful. I mean, you get this primal sort of fear that comes over you. I think that is normal with any sort of large animal anywhere you run into one. I've seen elephants run past my car in South Africa in Kruger National Park when I was there in my early 20s. And I mean, it's a very intense feeling. So a lot of that you see with other wildlife people who have had Sasquatch encounters report very similar kinds of things. Now, I don't think, if these things are killing people, we clearly would probably know more about them, or we would already have tracked them down and killed numbers of them. I think a vast majority of this violent behavior seems to be aggressive or territorial, like the cabin I was mentioning in Alaska. I mean, no one's ever been hurt or harmed or anything up there. And these are guys who hunt brown bear and moose, and they're used to these giant Alaskan critters that absolutely can kill you on a whim. And they've never been injured by anything strange or Sasquatch like up there. It just seems to be a lot of aggressive behavior, a lot of territorial sort of stuff. So in general, I mean, there are aggressive encounters, but I've heard very little of people. I mean, that we know of course, if somebody gets killed by Sasquatch, how are we going to know, right? But I don't think that's the norm. I think a lot of the stories of that the Native Americans told about the cannibal giants or the Sasquatch kidnapping their women and children and that sort of thing, even in Alaska with the luring in with the baby crying, I think a lot of that has more perhaps to do with maybe somebody went missing, right? Somebody out of the village went missing and they fell down a crevasse and were never seen again. And that was then blamed on the hairy man. Or maybe you did have a Sasquatch that came out and kidnapped someone and killed them. And just that one incident was enough to snowball into a boogeyman story that then becomes a good way to keep women and children from wandering out into a dangerous area and being mauled by a bear or attacked by a mountain lion or something like that. So I think, and that's cross-cultural. That goes into so many cultures have these sort of boogeyman stories. I mentioned earlier with the wood devil story, stories I was aware of, people being told, at family camps in northern New Hampshire in the wilderness, don't go too far out of the camp, or the wood devils will get you. And then you have these Native American stories too of going back thousands of years prior to that of don't go into the woods, or the Kushtaka will get you, or if you hear this sound, don't go in. I think a lot of that is cautionary tales that we as humans just in general tell each other. So, but it is interesting to maybe think about, well, if these things are a species, which they seem to be, maybe there's individuals that have had bad experiences with humans, so they're a little bit more aggressive. They're more nasty towards people. Maybe they've had bad experience with people with guns or groups of men, so there may be more of an aggression. Obviously, you have famous stories like the Bauman story of Teddy Roosevelt's friend who reported people being killed by a sort of Sasquatch, and other stories like that. I think that at Ape Canyon, I mean, another very famous incident, greatly investigated by Mark Mersell, I should add, who has kind of found that original site. But those stories tend to stand out because of how the aggressive nature. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at most of the sightings, and ones I've certainly heard, are not that unusual in the grand scheme of things, where it's a road crossing or a hiker seeing one or that sort of thing. Those aren't as sensational, so they don't really garner the kind of attention that something like an Ape Canyon story would. And that's why I think those are kind of the exceptions. They're not the rule. So whatever Sasquatch is, it probably has the ability to kill a person if it would want to, but that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, we have thousands of people investigating these things across North America, and not that many very horrific kind of incidents. There are certainly some. I've heard stuff with dogs being killed, that sort of thing. But again, those incidents seem to be the exception and not the rule in general, at least from my experience. So I've never seen a Sasquatch. I have had kind of a UFO, some crazy UFO kind of experiences. We've seen visually a craft in the sky in Pennsylvania and lights flying out of it. A very, very weird experience. But I've never seen a Sasquatch. I've had some encounters over the years in some of the locations we've been to, and here in New Hampshire as well, that I can't say are 100% a Sasquatch, but I can just sort of guess that maybe they fit the profile of behavior that's reported with a lot of the Sasquatch stuff. So we're talking stuff like wood knocking and rocks and objects being thrown into your direction, whoops, the vocalizations, that sort of thing, large things moving. But, those are things that the end of the day, I can't say 100%, as I just mentioned, but because there could be come out, oh, well, that was a moose actually, and I'd be totally satisfied with that. But a lot of the stuff that I've had happen, just kind of these audio incidents and these sorts of things, things being thrown or hearing things being thrown, they sort of fit the bill for purported Sasquatch behavior. So I put them in a category of, I can't confirm it, but they are in line with what others have reported and what others have experienced with Sasquatch sort of stuff. And kind of, to me, defy some of the more common explanations. If I'm able to take an experience and say, okay, well, was it a woodpecker? Was it a moose? Was it this? Was it that? if I can then reduce those options down to putting into a mysterious category, that's kind of where I place some of my experiences. I mean, for example, at that property in Alaska that I was talking about earlier, we had heard one night sitting around a campfire surrounded by this sort of this mossy hill in this rainforesty environment, just chattering away. This was at a point in May of 2022, so it was before you get those really long Alaskan summer nights where it only gets dusk about 2 hours at night. There was still a fair amount of darkness. After midnight till about 6 in the morning, it would get pretty dark up there, and you're in an area with some very dense tree cover and moss and all this sort of stuff. So we had heard what sounded like very clear wood knocks and what sounded like rocks being thrown and actually hitting things on the way down and hitting the shore covered in rocks before splashing into the water. It wasn't just like you'd hear just a water splash. Because if you hear that, you could say maybe that was an otter, maybe it was a sea lion. We know they're in the area and they splash and they make these horrific noises that sound like Sasquatch-like with weird vocalizations, but you can identify what that is. This genuinely sounded like something being thrown, hitting things along the way, crashing against the rock beach before bouncing into the water. The only thing we could really get to emulate that was physically throwing rocks and basically doing that same motion, having them bounce off the beach and into the water, trying to see if things will roll down, but you can't find many rocks in that big kind of environment with all those, the whole ground layer is covered in moss. So you can't really find rocks. The only place you find them is at the beach. And we're talking, being a couple 100 feet up from the beach, and in ways that even rolling a rock down the hill, it doesn't have that same effect. It gets caught up on and snagged on moss, or it just doesn't have that same sort of effect. But hearing that with wood knocks multiple times while we're just sitting around the campfire was interesting. That's just one, but there's been other ones similar to that. I mean, in famous louse camp in Bluff Creek, we heard this whoop. I mean, the clearest one I've heard of just like a whoop kind of noise that was preceded by an incident with my buddy's dog. As we were being shown the area where the original Bigfoot tracks were found in the 1950s, the Jerry Crew tracks that sort of spawned the name Bigfoot, we were being shown that area, and it was nighttime. There was a bunch of us there outside of Louse Camp, and guys were reporting hearing weird noises, and our buddy Ron's dog was acting very strange. And this is a dog that has hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, that has probably spent more time in the woods than most people, along with Ron, kind of as an adventure companion. The dog had his tail straight between his legs. I've never seen a dog that terrified. He never has to be leashed, and we had to take somebody's belt, our buddy Jonathan's belt, and physically make a leash to get this dog back to camp. Guys were saying they were hearing movement in the woods and light knocking noises. And then when we got back into camp, I was at the edge of camp checking on the dog then, and I happened to be filming. And at this point, Bandit was okay. He was doing a little better. And I go up and I'm petting him, and I hear this clear whoop come from kind of the woods behind camp. And I thought, oh, well, was that somebody in camp making that? And people 10 feet from me didn't even hear that noise. They were talking and chattering, so they missed it. It was one of those things you would miss otherwise. And that area of Louse Camp has a history of strange audio. A friend of mine, Jonathan, he got strange audio of something screaming there that he didn't even realize until reviewing the audio afterwards. Because when you're inside the camp, especially the center, you're talking, you're making noise. But if there's a creek that goes around it, Notice Creek and Bluff Creek, it creates this babbling brook sound, so it cancels out all the sounds. And people, Bobo finding Bigfoot had his sighting there in Louse Camp. There's been other reports, people seeing Sasquatches watching them from the hill above as they're swimming in the creek there. So that area has a history of it, and it was really interesting to experience something like that there. That I, upon analyzing the audio, kind of and having a person like Chris Spencer of the Olympic Project, who does a lot of great audio work, look at it and say, well, this is highly suspicious. Not being able to say, well, it's 100% a Sasquatch, but it's highly suspect in the way it sounds and the volume, and you're able to reduce it and conclude that it's not anyone in camp making this noise, especially after asking everybody. That was kind of an interesting one. But there's been other incidents, and I can't say every time I go in the woods I have something happen. Absolutely not. It's just every once in a while we'll have something happen that's pretty intriguing, that kind of keeps you going a little bit, and definitely interesting. Yeah, I mean, Stan Gordon's a really interesting guy. I know him through Small Town Monsters. A lot of the other films that we've done have revolved around that kind of Chestnut Ridge area, the Kecksburg UFO incident. He was kind of one of the guys drawing some of the conclusions between UFOs and Bigfoots and some of that stuff being seen. I can't really speak a whole lot to that, but I do know that Pennsylvania has a lot of that sort of activity, whether it be just strictly Bigfoot sightings or UFOs or things going on anomalously together. And my experience was in June of 2019. I was out in an area of kind of central Pennsylvania near DuBois, Pennsylvania. I was with a group of folks, including some that are more into the UFO and ghost stuff. My friend Paulino behind the paranormal from here in New England. Another guy who was Shane Surway, who was a little bit more into ghosts. Chuck Credo, who was a UFO kind of experiencer interviewer. So he would interview people who had encounters or claimed to be abducted and that sort of thing. And I was kind of the Bigfoot guy. So we're all kind of this mismatched group. And this was a case of an area they nicknamed the Pennsylvania Triangle, where property owners had been reporting a lot of weird activity, and there had been Bigfoot sightings in that area too. And at the time, I was kind of more dismissive of some of the other phenomena. I was a little bit more, yeah, whatever. I don't really care about orbs or any of this other weird stuff. I'm interested in the Bigfoot, right? And I'd been there 2 years in a row. And the first year there, saw a potential red orb kind of going through the woods. It was sort of weird, but nothing really extraordinary. But I talked to a lot of the witnesses. They had some really interesting Bigfoot stories in that area. People talking about hearing stuff for years outside their property, seeing what looked like a chimpanzee, kind of hairy chimpanzee juvenile thing skirting into the woods, having something actually jump out of a tree as they're hiking and running the other way. And just a lot of experiences, again, in this little area that was sort of these ravines, and you get these thick forests and then farmland. Pennsylvania is kind of an interesting environment in that you've also got the highest amount of hunters anywhere, I guess, registered in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of sightings out of Pennsylvania. It's on the top 10 list, I think, for Bigfoot sightings. But our second year there, 2019, we had been doing kind of an investigation where a number of us were split up in different areas. And I was in a truck down in the ravine where a lot of this Bigfoot stuff has happened on this property, and it had been raining, pouring rain. And then it finally cleared up, and it was beautiful, crystal, kind of clear skies with just stars, and looked incredible. So we all decided to rendezvous back up at the house, and we're sitting around kind of the fire pit and just enjoying. And I had my 10 millimeter fixed lens for my Canon 70D at the time, which fixed in the sense that I couldn't zoom in or out because I was doing astrophotography, something I love doing. And especially then, it was just so clear. And you're in an area where there's not a lot of light pollution because we're hours from Pittsburgh and hours from Philadelphia. So you're in a perfect, very rural area. So I was getting photos, and we were all just kind of hanging out and checking out star formation. You'd see planes go by every once in a while that were between Philly and Pittsburgh and that sort of thing, and other routes on the East Coast. But there's at one point where, again, I mentioned that the sky was completely clear at this point. There was nothing up there. And I see what looks like a cloud just kind of moving slowly. And I'm thinking, oh, it's the moon behind a cloud, but it didn't make sense for that time of the month, or there to be a full moon, and why this one little cloud was obstructing it. And it kind of came out of our left vision. It was sort of meandering through the sky like a leaf in slow motion. That's how I would describe it. And it just kept going. And we realized there was about 5 or 6 of us at that point watching this, including the property owner's place we were staying at. And we're looking at this thing saying, okay, this is kind of unusual. And it's moving. It's almost like it's getting closer to us. And it's just this hazy, undefined object. And then at one point, we see what looks like a small, bright light fly out of the top of the object and around it and back into it. And at this point, we're all freaking out. Oh my God, what is this that we're looking at? A couple of the guys there have been into UFOs for decades, and they said this was the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. I wasn't even really into the UFO stuff much at all, so it was really interesting for me. Other guys had said they'd had other sightings elsewhere, but this was the most spectacular. So we watched this thing for about 5 minutes. It's doing the same thing again. We watched this smaller, defined light fly out of it and fly back around into it. And at which point, I'm trying to get pictures of it with my 10 millimeter fixed lens with my phone. I didn't want to take my eyes off it and have to walk all the way back to the house to grab a lens to zoom in. Luckily, one of the guys did and grabbed their night vision camera and started filming it. So we have a few minutes of footage of this thing just slowly moving through the sky. In the footage, there's the second object is parallel. There's a small circular object parallel to this hazy shape, just kind of moving through the sky. And in real time, we watched this thing as it went over the horizon, basically. And then, we're kind of gathering ourselves, talking about what did we just witness? And myself and another guy witnessed actually just basically from the horizon into the sky, just this zip of light into the sky, almost like out of Star Wars or something, where they go into hyperspace. That's how I kind of have described it before. And it was just so unusual. I mean, it was so out of left field. We didn't really know what to make of it. And we decided to kind of write it down. and then wrote a kind of full report of that afterwards. And I have the footage as well on my website in a blog. I can share that with you too, and you can there's screenshots of the footage and that sort of thing. So we have some evidence that it was actually something there, and it is very unusual. And we actually sent it to a friend of ours who at the time I believe was the MUFON photo and video analyst. And he said, most of the time people send you UFO footage, you're able to debunk it or say, oh, it's just a thing that's anomalous that people are seeing that is a common object, but it may look strange. And this was one that genuinely stumped him. I mean, again, it was two objects flying, a large undefined one and a small circular object parallel to it in the footage. So really unusual. I mean, that was just it's to this date one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. And that got me a little bit more interested in the UFO topic. Before I didn't have a big interest, even though I grew up in New Hampshire where the Betty and Barney Hill case, that's a famous story from up in this area and kind of the abduction phenomena and the Exeter UFO incident. I've done a little bit more research into that, and I have other friends that are more into that topic. So it's always interesting to talk to them. But yeah, that was my sort of introduction to it. I had seen some other stuff in years prior that were just zipping lights in the sky, nothing groundbreaking. This was really kind of like, wow, that is intriguing. And I don't know what it is. I can only say it's a UFO by definition of the word, so unidentified flying object. I know a lot of people are using UAP now. That one of those two words, that's what it is. And I can't say if it was secret government technology or something from another world. I have no way of gauging that. I just know it was a very unusual thing, and I saw it with quite a few other people, and we have video evidence of it. So take it as you will. It is just an anomalous thing that we saw in the sky. And after that, basically our approach to investigating this area, we would have a local kind of town hall meeting where we'd try to gather some locals, and everyone kind of knows each other. It's a rural area, so we'd have people telling their stories, and it was great because I got to hear lots of Bigfoot stories from the area. Other people got to hear stories. Oh, the school kids see an unmarked black helicopter flying over that area. Weird stuff like that. And we were all super excited about our incident. We shared it, and they were like, oh yeah, that's cool. But that kind of stuff happens pretty often out here. We're thinking, oh my God, this was amazing. And these people are so desensitized to that kind of thing in this region that they thought it was sort of pretty common, which was a very funny reaction. I don't think any of us expected that. But the direct night after that happened, that visual incident, it was a cloudy, overcast night, and we went to a different location. I think it was like a continental divide line or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly, but if you look up Du Bois, Pennsylvania, there's some kind of line that goes through there. So we thought it'd be interesting to go to the top of this hill and kind of just mess around, do some meditation up there or whatever. Nothing ended up happening. So we go back to the property we were staying at where we actually witnessed the craft the night before. And around the same time, both these incidents happened just after midnight. So in kind of the AM, the early AM, we're all standing, and there was actually a couple more people that joined us that second night, and we're all standing in this garage of the property owners. And the property owner's bedroom, there's a couple, they were sleeping directly right above us, above the garage. And there's kind of a guest room in the basement. We had one of the guys in there just kind of laying there on his phone, and there was a bunch of us standing in the garage, and I had a table there with a bunch of my camera gear. And all of a sudden we start hearing this beep kind of noise, and it's just sustained. It's like a C note. And I think, oh my gosh, and they're all looking at me, hey, was your gear making this noise? I said, I don't have anything that makes that noise. There was a clutter in the garage. So I'm joking around with Paulino. I said, hey, Paul, what did you step on? Did you activate some kind of an old fire alarm or something that's here in the basement? So, and it was very loud. We were actually worried about waking up the property owners. So we're scrambling around trying to find the source of this noise. And there was a little, right towards the entrance of the garage, there was a little room to the side with the washing machine and the dryer. So we kind of instinctively went in there. There's 5 or 6 of us trying to see, okay, let's shut this thing off. And it distinctly, the sound sounded distinctly like it was inside the room with us, but then it sounds like it's outside. And we immediately, all of us were drawn outside, and this sound was in the air. That's the only way I could describe it in terms of it. It was not close to us. It sounded like it was in that sort of low cloud cover. And it was moving around. You could hear this beep kind of noise, and it was moving. You could hear it go from one area near the house. It sort of moved through the sky, and there was a patch of woods to the left of the house, and it moves over that patch of woods. For a few minutes we were listening to it, and it moves over the patch of woods, and just like somebody pressed an off button. It didn't fade out. It just went beep. It was like a hard cut. So, and we had a couple people already were recording on their phones at that point, that sound. And we were all kind of very puzzled. We thought, what the heck? I mean, this is and almost the same time after that visual incident the night before, but this sounded like it was in the basement with us, that we were all perplexed, thinking it was somebody's, my cameras or something we had set off by accident. And then I immediately rushed into the basement to ask the guy who's just kind of sitting there on his phone, and the door was cracked to the garage. I said, "Did you hear any of that?" He said, "No, what are you talking about?" Didn't hear anything. Next day, we talked to the property owners. They were sound asleep, didn't hear a thing. Again, we thought that sound was going to wake them up. That's why we were so worried about turning it off. We didn't want to be, rude guests and make a ruckus while there's people trying to sleep at almost 1 in the morning at that point. So that was anomalous. I really don't know how to even categorize that, other than it happened in a similar almost 24-hour time period after that visual object. We do have some audio of that. We had some people look at that and they said, well, it doesn't sound like a natural noise. I mean, some people equate it to like a Himalayan singing bowl kind of C note noise. And I'm not a music guy at all, so I couldn't speak to that. But we had people look at it and say it sounded like a mechanical noise. It wasn't a natural sort of wind or any kind of other category. So we just put it in an area of interesting, don't know what to say about it. So that was the visual and that were, if they are connected, I can't say they are, maybe they aren't, but they were, seemingly connected in a way where it's kind of the weirdest things I've ever had experienced in terms of UFO or any of that kind of stuff. So that's basically, it was a 2-night experience, and still one of the most interesting things I've ever seen with my own eyes.
That's interesting. It reminds me of the Sierra Sounds that I just did an interview with Ron Moorhead, and he talked about all of the very strange sounds they heard up at the Sierra camp, cowbell sounds and whirling sounds, tuning fork sounds. One night they thought their camp was being destroyed, and all this clanging, thought all of the pots and pans. It was exactly as it had been the night before. Just no explanation, for a lot. Some very strange sounds. Has anyone experienced odd things or oddities regarding Bigfoot?
Yeah, so a lot of people, obviously it's a big topic, asking about, the woo kind of side versus the flesh and blood. And I'm open-minded. I do lean more towards the flesh and blood myself, and I say this primarily because of the amount of people I've interviewed. A vast majority of them, it seems to be, as I mentioned earlier, those sightings that aren't necessarily very exciting on their own because they're just a fleeting glimpse or across the road sort of thing. Most of the sightings seem to fit into that category of it not really being that unusual in nature. And I think those more unusual reports, because of the sensationalism of them, they just get more traction. They're more unusual, right? There are, a small percentage of reports I've heard of people describing more paranormal type things in association with Bigfoot, weird lights and that sort of thing that I would say are credible, but I can't say, again, looking at just the raw amount of data, they don't seem to be the rule. They seem more to be the exception. And again, I'm open-minded. I mean, I don't know what these things are. I think regardless of whatever they are, there's clearly a physical element. They're clearly interacting with an environment, leaving footprints. I mean, throwing things. That's not something that's purely translucent being can do, right? So obviously there's, sort of an interaction there. So, but I do lean more towards flesh and blood simply because I think I've had the chance to see so many of these environments in North America that are so untouched even to this day. I mean, we are moving more and more as a society towards urban and suburban environments. There's less people living in rural areas, even compared to 200 years ago. Most of our ancestors lived agricultural lives or very close to the land. Living in the city was the exception. Now that's sort of becoming the rule. And I think it's unfortunate it's moving towards that, but our instincts have been cut off from the natural world in a lot of ways. So I think just that disconnection it allows other things to flourish. And we know animal populations in certain areas have bounced back. That doesn't mean we're not destroying our environment and wreaking a lot of havoc. I mean, humans are probably the worst thing in general for the environment and for other species, how many extinctions we've caused and other species we've managed to kill just throughout hunting and other things that we've done. I'm not an anti-hunter at all. I'm just saying, not without conservation in mind. So I think whatever Sasquatch is, we obviously we don't know. There are a number of people that are very interested in that sort of paranormal side, and I'm not negating that at all. I'm just going off of my personal experience. All the times we've been out in the woods and had weird experiences, aside from my UFO experience and other ones like that, most of the alleged Bigfoot encounters have been sort of within the line of Bigfoot reports. There was one exception when we were down in Florida filming with guys, Stacy Brown, and some of the people in this Outcast Paranormal kind of group. It's myself, Eli Watson, Tate Hieronymus. We were kind of the Bigfoot Beyond the Trail crew for that particular shoot. And we had done a split up. We were in an area where some of these guys had reported wood knocks and activity before. So we had split up in groups, and I was in a different group than Tate and a couple of other people. And Tate and another guy, they had heard wood knocks that night, a couple of them. And then at one point, Tate and this guy, James Brost, they had saw what they described as a small blue light just kind of shoot through the trees. And, it was clearly ground level, or not ground level, but in the trees. It wasn't above. I mean, this was an area of North Florida where they have these massive pine trees. And it's a sort of a sandy forested environment, very rugged kind of area, a habitat for a lot of different creatures. So the trees were fairly tall, and they were planted in that way, especially many years ago. So they saw this thing fly through the trees, and they were both kind of perplexed. Two other guys were with them in the group and didn't notice it because they had their backs turned. It happened that quickly. Now, as Tate would say, who is a very, he's kind of straight to the facts. He can't explain what it was. I have to take his word and James' word on what it was, that they don't know. Was it connected to Bigfoot? Maybe, maybe not. They really don't know. I mean, they heard those alleged wood knocks that night. Could that have been Bigfoot? Possibly. So, without making assumptions, we don't really know what that was. But that was definitely one of the weirder experiences just in my presence, sort of on the Bigfoot Beyond the Trail adventures, that I can, pin down, that were really kind of like, okay, that was kind of weird. I do think there's other stuff going on out in the woods. I don't necessarily think that has to be tied to Bigfoot. Maybe some people might want to do that, but if you saw a moose in the woods and then you saw an orb, would you assume that that moose is paranormal? And again, I'm not trying to negate anyone who's making those connections. I'm just saying I need more kind of hard proof myself, or hard evidence, to be able to kind of sway that way. But I am open-minded, like I said. Just majority of the people I've talked to and interviewed, their encounters seem to fit more of a biological perspective in terms of what these creatures are. But I am not at all against any ideas, because realistically, none of us really have the answers. We all have theories and guesses, and we're relying on a lot of anecdotal data, very little physical and other data. So it's all kind of a guessing game until someone gets proven right or wrong. And maybe it's a rat race to the bottom. I don't know. I just kind of, I try to go off of my experiences and what the people I've talked to, and really kind of stick to those guns, because those are my sort of, those are my experiences. I can't validate what other people in their research years ago have experienced or not. So that's the kind of way I look at it. And I think it's important to keep an open mind, but not too open that, your mind falls out, sort of thing, when it comes to that sort of thing, because I think it's easy to, again, the reports that are very sensational, that have a lot of strange elements, are obviously going to be more interesting than just another road crossing, that sort of thing. Whereas I think in the overall data, I think they all play a kind of part in maybe helping us look a little closer to what this topic is. But yeah, that's sort of what my take is on more of the stranger side of things. And again, you just heard me share my crazy UFO story. I'm definitely not against any of that weirder stuff. I just think there's more stuff out there than just Bigfoot in terms of unusual things that we can't explain now. Whether they're paranormal or not, I don't know. There's a reason why we call things paranormal or supernatural, things that are outside of our control. Try to explain Wi-Fi technology to someone in 1850, and you would probably be telling them about something paranormal, right? Maybe we'll understand in 100 years from now. I don't know. Cryptozoology researcher, as I like to fashion myself. I've always been interested in these sorts of mysterious topics. Obviously, Sasquatch is one of the bigger, well-known cryptids, so I've been doing quite a bit of filming and investigating on that in the past decade or so. And I really draw my interest from, as a child, hearing stories about the Yeti and other mysterious hominid kind of mysteries around the world, whether it be Sasquatch or Bigfoot in North America, or the Yowie. It was primarily the Yeti that sort of got me interested. I was told the story of it as a child by my father, and it just kind of stuck, that intrigue of looking into the mountains, saying the possibility that this could be out there is there. And that sort of is something I drew on from that young age. And I was always interested in the outdoors, and later into filmmaking. So my sort of my holy trinity, I suppose, in the way I approach the subject is, having the love for Sasquatch on one end and the love for filmmaking on other, and the love for being outdoors as the third part of that sort of interest. So that's kind of how I got into looking into Sasquatch and other cryptid creatures. I was actually born in South Africa. My parents moved to South Africa in the early 1990s when their home country of Yugoslavia in Southeast Europe was falling apart due to civil war. And a lot of people probably have heard of that sort of thing if they remember the 90s, Bosnia, and all that sort of mess. They went to South Africa, of all places. And I like to say that it's sort of my background that inspired some of my love in nature as well. My folks moved to an area of northern South Africa, about an hour north of Johannesburg, where I was actually born. Now, I don't remember any of my time in South Africa. I was quite young when we moved to the United States, but I grew up hearing stories of my folks seeing the ancient Bushman paintings in the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa, and biking along the border of Zambia with elephants, and my father having to almost fight off an ostrich trying to steal our lunch. All these sort of stories of Africa that just always intrigued me. So when I moved to the US, I actually lived in New York City, of all places, as a kid. And I remember some of my early memories always trying to be in the park, and I just hated that urban environment. I just was not a fan of it. And I actually grew up primarily here in the state of New Hampshire, which is the second most forested state in the United States. So I got an appreciation for being out in the woods and playing and catching bugs and snakes and salamanders and all sorts of things as a kid. So I grew up kind of enjoying the outdoors in that way. I didn't really grow up camping or hiking or fishing or any of that sort of stuff. Again, my parents were from Eastern Europe, from former communist kind of bloc there, Yugoslavia, which was socialist. So there wasn't as much of an outdoor culture. It wasn't until later in life that I gained an appreciation for hiking and backpacking. And I did some naturalism and survival training in high school, and kind of continued on from that point and started doing a lot of hiking here in the New England area. I've hiked all the 48 4,000-foot mountains in New Hampshire and many of the other mountains in the surrounding states, such as Maine and Vermont. So that sort of really pushed me on a path where I just love being outdoors all the time. And that has served me quite well with all the expeditions we've been on across the continent, really looking for Sasquatch in a variety of states and a variety of mountain ranges or swamps and all the sorts of territory. So my love for the outdoors, I think, is probably first and foremost in almost everything. So my interest in film primarily was probably spurred on just by being a kid of the 90s, Jurassic Park, a lot of these sorts of movies about dinosaurs. And I grew up watching documentaries about discovering fossils and all sorts of things. And I was really interested in that sort of thing. And I think it was nature and film that kind of came hand in hand. I grew up watching a lot of these documentaries. Naturally, that extended to things like In Search of and Monster Quest and other things that came later that were cryptid or Sasquatch related. And I always had sort of a love for filmmaking, but especially documentary filmmaking. And that's primarily the kind of stuff that's looking at wildlife. You have documentary, wildlife photography, that sort of thing. That's primarily what you're going to be documenting nature with, along with cryptid creatures. It's more along that style. So that kind of filmmaking really attracted me because it is sort of an honest medium. I mean, not that feature films or narrative films, I should say, are dishonest, but they're fiction. They're works of the imagination. I think that's amazing. I mean, I've written scripts for films as well they're narrative films too, but I like documenting the kind of reality that's out there. So documentary filmmaking really fits into that. And in some ways it's a form of journalism, but it's also, you're documenting lots of different stories. It's very people oriented. So you're documenting stories that people tell you. That's a huge component within this topic, certainly others as well. But it was primarily documentary filmmaking that got me kind of inspired in it. And a lot of those, I have to credit a lot of those documentaries I grew up watching when I was younger, and some of the programs, Discovery Channel, History Channel, that sort of stuff, that before it was as sensationalistic as it is today, there was a lot more focus on history and wildlife and those sorts of things. So that's primarily where my interest in filmmaking came from. Oh, how many films have I done relating to cryptids? A lot. I mean, technically, because of the YouTube series I do called Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, we've got almost up to 30 episodes of that. And those are all each kind of their own sort of 45-minute to an hour long feature sort of film. But I've done quite a few other films. I've done films on a film on the Lake Champlain monsters, which is actually a multi-part kind of series. I've done a feature film on mystery big cats of New England called Lions of the East. My first ever film was called Mystery at Loch Ness, which was about the Loch Ness monster. Very poorly made, sort of first foray into the subject. And I would do these short YouTube documentaries as well for my Sasquatch Out of the Shadows YouTube channel, in which I would oftentimes interview witnesses, or I'd go to locations and talk to people. And so at this point, I mean, maybe under 100 films total. And when I say films, I'm using that semi loosely because a lot of these are to YouTube releases. So, I mean, I've done a few films that are kind of legitimate that you'd put on a streaming platform and that sort of thing. But YouTube filmmaking, I think, changes the game a little bit now because you're able to reach an audience in a sort of non-traditional way. It's not a big premiere with DVDs and that sort of thing. It's much more kind of direct to your audience. So yeah, there's been quite a few of them, and most of them have been relating to the Sasquatch topic. Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, I've been doing for about 2 years now, and I just found out we got over 10 million views collectively just on Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, literally a day or two ago, which is pretty interesting. I mean, it's not all about the views, but it's really nice to have your work kind of rewarded in that way, and people enjoy what you do. But a big inspiration for Bigfoot Beyond the Trail would be definitely a lot of the stuff I grew up watching. So In Search Of, Monster Quest, Survivor Man. So Les Stroud, before his sort of Bigfoot days, he had the show Survivor Man. I took a lot of inspiration from that. I grew up kind of watching that in the 2000s. That was a novel concept, and that sort of survivalism, bushcraft, really kind of influential with the really do-it-yourself kind of filmmaking, guerrilla filmmaking, where it's just one guy and his camera equipment. There's no big crew or anything like that. That's a big inspiration for me. Obviously, Les has then done a lot of Sasquatch related stuff in a whole Survivor Man Bigfoot series, but before that, primarily just I was influenced a lot by the that sort of style of the DIY filmmaking. And the idea sort of was sparked on with my friend Seth Breedlove and I of Small Town Monsters. We kind of talked about doing an investigative Sasquatch related series that followed myself, and we kind of concocted the idea. I sort of had a pitch. I kind of figured this is what we might be able to do. Basically, just me taking a camera or a few cameras out in the woods and kind of seeing what happens. And that's basically what we did. And that's sort of the format that we followed. And it's morphed over time, and there's been different styles with Bigfoot Beyond the Trail. We have episodes that are more focused on the eyewitnesses and talking to local researchers. We'll usually go out to an area, kind of investigate. But one of the biggest things for me has been kind of promoting a sort of critical thinking and kind of trying to take the Bigfoot off the brain, so to speak. A lot of researchers, I think, especially people when they first get involved, they go out into the woods and maybe they don't have a solid foundation of knowledge in the woods in terms of what animals are there, the sounds they make, the kind of natural phenomena that you can run into that I think a lot of people mistake for Bigfoot activity. I think Bigfoot evidence is fairly rare unless you really know what you're looking for, have a lot of experience, I suppose. And I'm not saying I have a lot of experience. I just, I try to be very critical of alleged evidence and rule out all other possibilities before resorting to Bigfoot. I think that shouldn't be the first choice that you choose, unless, of course, you see one in front of you. But then there's a whole host of other issues with that, in terms of vetting yourself as a researcher having a sighting. I'd be more skeptical. So if I were to have a sighting, I'd want to get somebody to grill me on all the details and kind of ask me the tough questions. So make sure it's not wishful thinking or me projecting what I want to see. But promoting that sort of critical thinking, I think just the Occam's razor element within the Sasquatch topic, I think in the past few years and maybe even decades, the topic has been inundated with a lot of sensationalism, whether that's coming from individuals or even television programs and larger kind of productions that I don't think really portray a truth about the subject. I mean, a lot of those cases is just about selling a product, right? They want a product, they want returning viewers and that sort of thing, where I'm able to tell the stories I want about Sasquatch without that sensationalism element. I can do it exactly how I want and basically portray that in a way that I think the topic deserves to be portrayed, a little more level-headedness within the topic in general. Because I say there's a lot of sensationalism, I think, to this day, and I feel like a lot of those programs that folks into this topic, even older than myself, obviously grew up on, and people saw things like The Legend of Boggy Creek or the original In Search Of series. And there was almost like a little bit more of a seriousness with the topic when reality television came into the media landscape in the 2000s. That really changed TV, as you see with a lot of channels, as I mentioned earlier, History Channel, Discovery Channel. They pivoted towards reality TV because it's cheaper to make that stuff. You just get a group of characters together and kind of instill some drama, and they go at each other's throats. It's a lot easier and cheaper to produce a show like that than one where you have to get extensive DNA tests done and hire scientists to come on your crew. So in general, networks have pivoted more towards that reality TV sort of model, which I think is unfortunate. I think there's a reason why independent filmmakers like myself, and Small Town Monsters, and others have found a receptive audience, because these are people who want to be treated seriously like adults, not treated like children that are being spoon-fed sort of sensationalist kind of garbage, unfortunately, in a lot of cases with some of these shows. And they're not all bad. I mean, you've got programs like Finding Bigfoot that I think paved the way for a wider popularity with Sasquatch, absolutely. And you talk to people like Cliff and Bobo and some of those guys involved in that show, and they're really, truly passionate about this topic. But they'll be very open and tell you we worked within the limits of television that we were able to, and try to promote as much truth as we could within that sort of window. Well, we don't have that restriction as independent filmmakers, which is amazing. We're able to just tell the stories, tell the eyewitness stories, especially. Prior to doing Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, I had been interviewing people for years here in the Northeast in my state of New Hampshire, and I knew the difficulties of working with eyewitnesses and people that have stories that oftentimes are sometimes traumatic, something that maybe that happened to them 20 years ago and they've been ridiculed for it before. Maybe their families made fun of them, or they mentioned it once at work and now they're the kooky Bigfoot guy. So they almost sit on these stories until they retire, or they're just very socially unwilling to share their encounters. And I've heard time and time again about whether it's television programs or others exploiting these stories and kind of making the people look silly. And I'm very cognizant of that when I talk to eyewitnesses and when I share their stories. I really try to make sure they're comfortable with it and they want to share their story with me. And from all the people I've interviewed, I don't think I've had anyone really complain about the way we've portrayed their stories. And what's so neat is we don't have to cut down their 20-minute interview to a 30-second clip they're going to put in between some action shots like a program would do. We can actually keep a majority of that interview relatively unscathed within one of our documentaries, which TV, the way they format it, just wouldn't work. So being able to kind of retain that creative control is really awesome. We don't have a big network on our shoulder telling us, well, this is interesting, but you should put in these obviously fake howls that we got from some other video and have you guys react to that and make that seem like it's part of the video. So being able to avoid all that and sidestep that is fantastic. And I don't expect people to believe me. I tell all the time, I say, fully transparent. Don't trust me. I'm just a guy online. Do your own research, please. Don't believe anyone. If someone tells you they have all the answers, be skeptical of that. You should be able to question. If they can't withstand the questioning and they get defensive and don't want to kind of address those claims, just be skeptical of what you hear online. That's basically kind of what I try to push. One of the other big things that I take such pride in with some of the work that I do is being able to showcase some of these natural landscapes, right? We've been so blessed to go to so many incredible locations across North America, from rugged mountain peaks in the Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, the swamps of down south, the Appalachians on the East Coast, just so many incredible places, and seeing how incredible this world is. And being able to show that in its full glory is something I am very aware of. A lot of films I've watched and a lot of documentaries about this topic, they take you to a location, but I don't think they try to showcase that location. They'll say, oh, this is the Mount Hood, Oregon wilderness. You get kind of a feel for it, but we try to make it as immersive as possible. I mean, I've had so many people tell me they felt like they were there with us, the way we captured it with the drones or with the other footage and the time lapses and that sort of thing, because these locations kind of speak for themselves, especially these remote areas where some of these Sasquatch reports have come out of. It's just sort of an area that you look at and say it makes sense for something to possibly exist in these areas. So being able to capture that in kind of its full glory is something I'm very aware of, and something I try to do to the best of my abilities. And Again, a lot of these places sort of speak for themselves. You just point the camera and they sort of show you their glory. So it's not like there's some extreme tech or ability going on there. It's just being in these amazing locations and sharing that. So inspiring people to get out in nature is a huge one, even if they're not interested in Bigfoot or anything along those lines, especially in this day and age with tech encroachment kind of all around us. I think it's important to get outside in the woods or your local areas and just sort of decompress from everything, and absolutely kind of necessary for myself, and I know a lot of other people's as well. Yeah, I do think that showcasing some of those environments is definitely a part of the success. I mean, we get to show some of the other animals that live there. I mean, whether it be seeing bear or moose, or filming aerial shots of humpback whales surfacing, or orcas, or whatever the case may be, mountain goats. I mean, alligators, snakes, deadly cottonmouth snake from 7 feet away. We get to showcase this, and I think that's part of my overall sort of message, is portraying, hey, if you're going into an environment like this, realize you have all these critters that live there. This is stuff that, if you're as an investigator, as an honest investigator, you want to be able to be familiar with, so you can kind of get rid of that as a possibility, and something, you may have something mysterious happen. We'll know there are other animals that live there, know that environment, know what they sound like, know what these animals sound like, what they do, kind of their habits. Educate yourself more broadly. Don't just go in the woods and assume you're going to find a Bigfoot. Say, okay, well, I know this habitat supports moose. Can I find any indications of that? Is there any scat? Are there any places that might look like a suitable moose habitat? That sort of thing. Realize that that forest, if Sasquatch is a creature that enjoys living in these woods like all these other animals, that it interacts with other creatures as well. There is a sort of balance that all things in the forest and all things in the wild have. So Sasquatch would have to be a part of that, whatever it is. I mean, that's a whole other topic. Whether it's flesh and blood or not, there is clearly an element of it being in this sort of environment, in the wilderness and in wild areas. So just being able to showcase some of that natural kind of wonder is definitely, I think a lot of people have mentioned, that's a reason why they like to watch. Again, the skepticism, not necessarily skepticism, but the level-headedness. I've heard a lot of people say, we're not ones to jump quickly on, oh, every noise is a Sasquatch or everything is Bigfoot related. And not every time we turn the camera on, you're not going to have something jumping out at you like a lot of programs, I think, would like you to believe is the case, because they're trying to create exciting programming. We get to just be very straightforward and tell exactly what happened. We're not going to tell you, hey, this happened, when it actually didn't. We get to say, well, we didn't really have anything happen here, and that sort of thing. Or, oh, we heard this sound, but it turned out to be something else. It turned out to be a known animal, or it turned out to be, just an anomaly with equipment, or whatever the case may be. I think that a lot of those factors have contributed, but I do think, going to that wide variety of locations, whether it be Bluff Creek or the Everglades of Florida or remote Alaska, those locations inspire that sense of wonder in a lot of people. But definitely, there's a multi factors, I'd say, to why people really enjoy watching some of the Bigfoot Beyond the Trail. And again, it's awesome for me because I get to tell these stories in ways that I want to, and essentially they're cases that I'm personally interested in, and I get the chance to go to places that I don't think I would have even imagined going to years ago prior to doing this. So it's absolutely been a blessing. And one of the most amazing things is hearing from people who aren't able to get out into the woods, whether they're physically or old or whatever the case may be, with their limitations, and they live kind of vicariously through us. I've gotten that quite a few times, and it's always heartwarming to hear that, especially people that have it really rough in life, whether they have some sort of disease or issue with their well-being. Bringing some little joy to them and hearing that feedback, to me, is huge. And also inspiring those younger folks to get out into nature and enjoy what this world has to offer.